Hello everyone, welcome to part 2 of the Planeswalker Project's Guide to Commander 2019. In this video, we're going to be taking apart the Primal Genesis precon, a Naya colored deck built around the Populate mechanic. We're going to be looking at some of the better reprints included in the deck, some of the better cards that are new to the game, key cards in the deck, and of course, we're going to look on how some upgrades might make this deck run better. And if you enjoy this video and would like to see this series return for Commander 2020 next year, consider hitting that like button to show your support. And that being said, let's get right into it. So we have our 3 commander options that are ready to lead right out of the box, as always. Ghired, Conclave, Exile is a 2/5 for 5 mana in Naya colors that reads, when Ghired enters the battlefield, create a 4/4 green Rhino creature token with Trample. Whenever Ghired attacks, Populate. The token enters the battlefield tapped and attacking. So Ghired is a pretty aggressive take on the Populate mechanic, likely due to the inclusion of red magic. I feel like for the sake of this deck, he is the proper choice to make for right out of the box play if you're really gunning for that Populate mechanic. I'm going to preface the rest of this video by stating that I'm not the biggest fan of the Populate mechanic. As a token player, I much rather prefer making many smaller tokens and going wider rather than making fewer, larger tokens. I also feel that some Populate cards are rather high on the curve than I'd like them to be, but that's just me. But I will try to put this bias aside for the remainder of this video, but just putting that out there. Ghired's stats are a little odd for the aggression he's going for, though I imagine that's just his Selesnya showing. I like the size and beefiness of the Rhino he makes, and I think he's a proper way to go about Populate. Now let's look at our other alternate commanders. Atla Palani, Nest Tender is a 2/3 for 4 mana that reads, for 2 mana and tapping, we create a 0/1 green egg creature token with Defender. Whenever an egg we control dies, reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a creature card. Put that card onto the battlefield and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. Okay, so Atla is a number of things. I personally feel like if you're wanting to go a more traditional token route, Atla might be the proper choice. I actually have several ideas bubbling around for this deck, and I am affectionately referring to all of them as my lovely Sunday scrambled eggs. The eggs are a very interesting way to go about cheating mana costs, as it does not exclusively specify her egg tokens, but in fact any egg creature. So cards like Dragon's Egg will still trigger her ability, and you can cheat out whatever your next creature is for free. So if you manage to manipulate the top cards of your library, like say with tutors, you can start getting a really strong engine going, and I might take a crack at building this later down the line. Those eggs can be great deterrents to attacks, as your opponents wouldn't want that egg to hatch into something that they won't be able to handle. And I think that's what really makes Atla the strongest commander to come from this deck. Maybe not the commander as the precon out of the box, but we'll see how she does on her own. Finally, we have Marisi, Breaker of the Coil. This 5/4 for 4 mana reads, your opponents cannot place spells during combat. Whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, goad each creature that player controls. So Marisi is another cat commander, and I feel like this is the nastiest of the 3 in terms of control-y shenanigans. Marisi is capable of deterring your opponents from attacking you simply by making them have to attack each other instead. If you manage to hit any of your opponents, you're not only safe from their attack on their next turn, but you're likely going to be able to continue picking on them by attacking them again and again. I am reminded of one of my favorite Naya commanders, Ghired Honored One, with this kitty. What I really like about this card is that Marisi technically does not have to lead a token deck, and so you can put him as the head of any Naya deck that wants to go aggro and it'll still work. The first ability restricting opponents from playing spells during combat works on all turns, not just yours, which ensures that combat is going to happen mostly as planned. This is a commander that I think actually might work as the commander of this deck out of the box, so unlike the Morph deck, we do have some options. Now then, we got plenty of reprints in each of these decks, but I really want to hone in and pick up some that I think stand out from the rest. I will note that I will not repeat cards that were mentioned in other videos, so while this deck also includes a copy of Sakura Try the Elder, I will not include it in this segment. Firstly, Feldon of the Third Path is a great commander for mono red, and a rather unique take on Reanimator in red that we really don't see elsewhere. He's a super flavorful card, but with a very rich history, so do read up on his lore sometime if you have a chance. I also love seeing old legendary creatures get the swoopy new card frame treatment. Garruk Primal Hunter is this deck's Planeswalker inclusion, and this is something that I think that they've started expanding upon with this release, and I really like it. This Garruk creates a lot of value on his own, letting you create beasties, letting you draw cards, and if you should be able to get him up to this ultimate, a ton of giant worms that'll send your opponents packing. I'm also hoping this is hinting at easing Garruk back into the minds of players, as rumors are swirling of his return to the main story. Thragtusk is one of my favorite value engines in this deck, giving you card value and life gain on a pretty beefy boy, and it's a staple in my beast deck. Tristani, Selesnya's voice, is one of the best token commanders in there, giving you tons of life gain when you play your creatures, and if you decide to take the red cards out of this deck and go with traditional Selesnya route, I would highly recommend building into her. Finally, Dragon Master Outcast is a very innocuous card to drop early on, and as you accumulate lands and build up to that 6th land, your opponents might forget it's there, and suddenly they begin facing down some big beefy dragons, making for an excellent Populate target. So in addition to our reprints, we also got some new cards that are seeing their first printing ever. And once again, I will be honing in on the specific new cards that I think are the strongest from this set. Doomed Artisan is in a lot of ways the white version of Bitter Blossom. Creating these tokens in more numbers will not only build up a sizable army in their numbers alone, but their strength increases as their population increases. The only problem is getting them to attack or block while the Doomed Artisan is in play. So to remedy this, you just throw the little artisan in front of something, and suddenly your entire board of giant artworks turn on. Orin Frostfang is a nicely sized snake that gives all of your attacking creatures Death Touch. Whenever a creature you control connects with an opponent, you draw a card. So this is pretty much a larger scale version of the Orin Viper, which is a favorite in a lot of my decks. It has a pretty tough body on it, making it likely to stick around for some time and getting you some value, especially if you manage to go wide with your creatures. Putting card draw on your tokens that also have Death Touch when they attack make it so that your opponents are going to be in a tight spot whether they want to let you draw cards or trade their real creatures for tokens. So a really good engine with this. Full Flowering is a card that sort of breaks the ideology of Populate in a way that I can get behind. See, my problem with Mechanic was always the small number of tokens you actually get out of each of the Populate triggers, and so getting multiple Populate triggers on one card can net you a decent board. You do have to sink quite a bit of mana in this to get any return, but in token decks that run cards like Cryptolith right, you can generate more mana to really dig deep with this. Song of the World Soul is another way to break the mechanic of Populate. With every spell you get a Populate trigger, and so suddenly your smaller innocuous spells actually are going to be netting you a lot more value if you already have some tokens into play. I'm reminded of Inexorable Tide with this, which gives you a Proliferate trigger upon every cast, and that card is an absolute tank in my Infect deck, so this card should be pretty powerful as well for Populate. Now, I do want to mention some all-stars in this deck, having a few cards included that I think really stand out as some of the better cards to focus on with this strategy. Wayfaring Temple is a rather aggressive creature that helps Populate whenever it deals combat damage to a player, which allows you to get another token copy. In my upgraded version of this deck, the Temple is a card we actually mean to replicate a number of times using some key token producers, as its power and toughness variable works great with our strategy. We'll get more into that later. Angel of Sanctions acts as an Oblivion Ring on a creature, and given the Populate mechanic working in tandem with the Embalm ability on the Angel, once we start getting more zombified Angels, we're likely going to see a lot less of our opponents' board. I like that for these precons, they went with a bit more creative take on certain abilities crucial to Commander, like removal, than just sticking in a copy of O-Ring. Giant Adaphage, while absolutely repulsive on a creature, is something I actually really like as an inspiration for where to take this deck. It's a giant bug that whenever it connects with an opponent, you get a token copy of it. Given that it's a 7/7 with Trample, it shouldn't be hard to get at least 1 point through. Opponents will be falling over themselves trying to block this to prevent you from getting more of them. Note that the tokens this creates are copies of it, so they do have the same ability, and if they connect, you'll get more token copies of them. So this can grow exponentially dangerous, and with the Populate triggers, we can get a huge swarm of these monstrosities. So I'll be honest with you, I am actually not a big fan of Phyrexian Rebirth, normally. But in this deck, being able to recover after a board wipe like this, that could potentially leave us with a tremendous creature that we can populate with, this card is a brutal way to clear the board. Growing ranks, I put in the same category as the aforementioned Song of the World Soul. Getting a free Proliferate trigger on each one of our upkeeps means that we can get free value every turn. This deck manages to get enough Populate triggers going with its various spells that I think we can still go wide as I generally like to, without being super hindered by any of the clunkier Populate spells that are out there. Now that we have the deck in our hands, I want to upgrade it so it runs a little better. There are a few cards I want to cut from the deck so that they don't synergize enough, or that they don't do enough to validate their inclusion. Cliffside Rescuer is kind of so-so protection for one creature, and given that we are a token deck and in fact making a great many creatures, I'd rather run something that gives a bit more blanket coverage for all of my creatures. Heartpiecer Manticore's best utility is when you embalm it, and given that that's a 7 mana embalm cost for what's essentially Fling, I could pick so many other cards to work better in this stead. Tahngarth First Main is a 2-color legend that's included in this deck, and in this case, does minimal to help with the Populate strategy, and is more in line for an aggressive Chaos deck. I'm sorry, Tahngarth, but not this time. Voice of Many, while a very interesting card draw card, just costs too much, and it relies way too heavily on us already having an established board presence, and quite frankly, I can include better options for card draw. Soul of Zendikar is out, just for the sheer clunkiness of it and its abilities. Even though we are in green, the ramp isn't super strong out of the box with this deck, that I feel a 6 mana card is worth running that you still need to funnel more mana into. I'm honestly more excited that Rampaging Baloths got included and being able to make creatures with a lot less effort, and this is only like his 5th reprint in a precon. Amara Tandris is out, I'm sorry, but again, at 7 mana, the ability she provides is just too minimal to make value out of the deck. Now, to replace these cards, I do have some suggestions, and of course there's a whole list more, but we're not going to go into every single one of them right now. You'll see that when we get the fully upgraded deck list when we touch upon that later on. The first and foremost is Bramble Sovereign. This card is actually a pretty interesting generator of tokens, as it makes tokens of non-token creatures. And this is a creative way to start abusing that Populate ability, as those new token clones of our non-token creatures can be populated to get us even more value out of them. Growing Rites of Itlimoc can be a valuable method to ramp. Once you hit 4 or more creatures, this card flips into what is essentially Gaia's Cradle. This can net you a ton of mana to go off of and do more crazy shenanigans with. Cryptolith Ray, I'm surprised to say, wasn't in the deck. This deck can use quite a bit more ramp in it to utilize your creatures, but I won't bog down all my add-ins by adding in all this ramp nonsense. But with the rights in play, we were able to use our creatures for mana, and should we have some Populate triggers to sink our mana into, we can set ourselves up for quite an explosive play. Helm of the Host is essentially a Populate trigger, except it's on an equipment and it lacks the keyword. It also gives haste to the token it generates. This can be especially powerful on cards like the Wayfaring Temple, where we can generate a method that has the ability to make more and more tokens, and so this can get out of hand very quickly. Finale of Glory is a nice mass token generator. It's a bit of a powered up version of White Sun Zenith. If we could churn 10 or more mana into that X cost, suddenly not only do we get a dozen soldiers, but we get a dozen angels for some very powerful value. Ovia Pasiri, the Sage Lifecrafter, can create smaller servo tokens, or if we have a big enough board, those XX constructs she generates can come out as super huge creatures. I feel like I want to include some smaller cards to build out the bottom end of the curve so that we have things to play early game and maybe start getting some tokens in play. Impact Tremors and or Purphoros, God of the Forge, are great in this deck. Purphoros is substantially more expensive price-wise, but given how many tokens we can generate, you could just start singeing each of your opponents with every one you make, and that'll eventually start chipping away at their life total so it becomes just precariously low enough that the rest of your army can take it out. So, I will say that for this deck, I'm rather underwhelmed at what I perceive as the power level of the deck. The Morph deck has such a built-in engine of value in its card draw, mana reduction, and just general morph abilities that really can be built upon, this deck feels a little less intense in those areas. We do have potential, don't get me wrong, but I feel like we have a lot of weeds to cut out before the real blooms can come in. Looking through the EDHRec page for token decks, even excluding powerhouse price banks like Doubling Season, Risk the Redeemed, and so on, we have a lot of cards that we can start including to start focusing the deck more and making it run more smoothly. I like the strategy that is had in mind for the deck, but I personally feel the execution of the deck might have fallen short compared to the previous one. Anyway, that is going to wrap up our look at the Primal Genesis precon deck from Commander in 2019. What cards are you most excited to try out in this deck? Will this deck be the one you buy to start building through this year's precons? I hope you enjoyed this video. Remember to subscribe with notifications turned on so you can check out all the other decks from this year's precons as we explore all 4 of the Commander decks. As always, I appreciate your time hanging out with me, chatting some Magic the Gathering, and I'll see you all next time.